Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'd like to also welcome those of you who are watching this segment at home. We're going to be discussing decision strategy innovation. Decision strategy innovation, that's a mouthful, isn't it? It's like three big concepts thrown together. The way we're going to be talking about it today has to do more with not three big concepts, but one even bigger concept. It is an entire paradigmatic shift. It represents an entirely different approach in thought and process development. And that approach consists of utilizing all of our tools and skills in the most powerful and effective ways. It's about using your rational intelligence, of course, but also using your inspirational, intuitive awareness, your subjective knowledge, your emotional intelligence, and often creativity. We get to be creative more than we realize sometimes if we give ourselves the opportunity to do so. It's really the how to get things done. It's how to get things done. We can study different wonderful platforms that are out there in management and in personal success, but we have to be able to know how to be able to apply those platforms. And if we do it well and we do it consistently and we work with this kind of an approach where we are using all of our tools, all of our resources, it leads to more confidence, more competence, more courage, more resilience, and ultimately more successful outcomes because we have the ability to work with all of the aspects of what is going on in a given situation and not just deal with them in a static and formulaic way. So let's talk a little bit about the decision component, making decisions, how we make decisions. Most of us make many decisions, many times a day. We get up in the morning, we get our coffee, we jump into the shower perhaps, or perhaps we jump to the shower and then get our coffee. We head off to work, and we get there and we don't even know how we got there. Have you ever had that happen to you? I've had that happen to me every now and then. Luckily, not very often and not recently, but where you just drive to work and you have no idea how you got there. The car got you there somehow, but you don't know what happened along the way. You don't know what turns you made. You don't know where you exited. You have absolutely no idea. And that's called being unconscious. Being unconscious of what it is you're doing, how you're doing it, where you're doing it, what you're really doing. Many of us go through segments in our lives that are like that. I had a client talk to me recently where she said she ran into somebody the other day and she had met this individual about a year ago and went out with him several times, had no recollection. And he, on the other hand, was able to comment on stories she told him, some personal things she'd explained to him. It was clear he did know her, he had met her. Not a clue. Not a clue. Now, granted, this often happens to us when we're under a lot of stress, when we worry a great deal, when we are feeling somehow under the thumb of circumstances or events in life, and we start to just sort of drop out in terms of our awareness. And there are dangers to this. There are all sorts of dangers to this. And if you're not doing things consciously, I don't think I have to explain what kind of bad things can happen to us. We really need to be able to be present and to know what we're doing, how we're doing it, where we're doing it, and where we're going with all of it. Okay, that's a lot there. But I think I've made the point that consciousness is a critical element to our decision making. Habits are wonderful. Habits can be very important in our lives. And for example, certain habits in our workplace are very, very effective. We want to be efficient. We want to show up on time for meetings. We want to be able to provide information to people when they request it. We want to be able to follow up on additional action items. If we don't do these things, it's not just a question of leading a more relaxed work life. It can jeopardize our reputation, promotions, sometimes even a job. So yes, good, strong, basic habits are very important. However, when we're dealing with interactions, when we're dealing with sort of different moving parts to the decision making, different people involved, different issues, different elements, different situations, well, something a little bit more dynamic is needed. We need to come up with strategy. Now, when I refer to strategy, it doesn't mean that we can't have an incorporated element of habit, but strategy has to be more than an accumulation of our habits. It needs to be something that has room and space for growth and development, for the opportunity to engage in an active way. And this brings me to another very, very important point, when I mentioned the active way. Another thing that we tend to do, besides engage our situations in a very habituated fashion, is that we tend to also be very reactive. When we think about it, more often than not, I'm already seeing some people nod, no, I'm not really that reactive. I tend to respond. I don't really react. But you know, we often do react, and we don't really think about what it is, where we're taking the situation, or where we're taking this, instead of a response, treating it as a reaction. There are times when a reaction is perfectly fine. You need to get out of the way of a moving train, then yes, a reaction is something that is important. And even then, sometimes a response is needed. I'm going to tell a little story later on at the end of our segment about that very thing. I was in a situation with somebody driving a car. We were getting on an off-ramp on the freeway in California. I was not driving, someone else was. And the gentleman behind us didn't realize that the ramp, it was a long ramp, it was backed up, and the cars were stopping. And he was still full throttle exiting the freeway. Well, we were terrified that he was going to hit us from behind. That was the very next obvious thing to happen. And he obviously had a reaction as well and was pretty terrified, because he went ahead and grabbed the steering wheel and veered 3 lanes across the freeway to the left. And we could see this because the ramp was quite long, so we could see what was going on in the freeway. He just veered all the way to the left. And miraculously, no car hit him. It was really quite busy that particular day. There were a lot of cars. There was a lot of traffic. And then he overcorrected and veered 2 lanes to the right. And again, didn't hit anybody, because by now people were seeing that he was having marginal control of the car and had obviously been in a situation where he might have been in an accident, so he's now trying to find a way to get himself straightened out. And he veered 1 more time into the center lane. Well, that was a reaction, and he needed to make corrections for that reaction. You'll often hear, this is another type of example, you'll often hear companies, countries, speaking about how they had to react. Often when there is a reaction, there has to be a correction. If you think about it for a bit, a reaction doesn't involve any kind of analysis, any kind of ability to parse out what the component parts are of the situation. In a reaction, you just do that. You go right into whatever you have to do. With a response, it doesn't have to take very, very long for the response, depending on the situation. Sometimes the response can be very complicated. But with these companies and these countries, as with them, you'll often hear afterwards, well, that they had to do a correction. They had to reanalyze what had happened and perhaps take some additional steps. In fact, almost always they have to take additional steps to balance out whatever had taken place. But this is a good way of looking at the notion of reaction and response. So, as we look at the idea of habit versus a dynamic strategy of action, there's also reaction and response in a kind of a parallel concept. And these are 2 features that I'm going to discuss today, that I've been discussing today. We don't have time to go into others. There are other elements of this notion of making decisions and dealing with them strategically. The bottom line is, if you are dealing with your strategies, or your habits, however you choose to look at them, and you're not finding that you're getting the kind of results that you're working for, that you're working so hard for, whether on a personal level or in your professional life, then it is time for some kind of change, for an innovation, and for something more dramatic and dynamic to enter your life. Something more vital, something that has a kind of living reality to it, and that's the type of strategy that we're going to be talking about here. Now, I have had people say things to me like, well, I don't really want to have to think that much. That's too much thought to put into it. It's not so much that you have to put thought into it to that degree. It is about incorporating the dynamic of your perception, of your presence, of your awareness. And that's what helps to create the innovation. Innovations can be subtle. They can be very subtle. They don't have to be something that moves the earth, but they can be enough to make the difference between success and failure. And if we go through enough failures over and over again, well, that becomes a different kind of habit, and not one that would be encouraged, not one that would make us happy, not one that would take us forward in our lives or in our professional work effort. Now, people have said to me, so what is this innovation? How do you do this innovation? You're talking about all these elements. How do you do this innovation? It all depends. It all depends on the circumstance, and that is why it is so dynamic. It depends on who the players are, how they are involved, what are their roles, what are some of the issues, what are some of the issues that are supportive of your situation or position, what are some of the challenges. Often there are concepts or ideas that come up that are sort of on the periphery, and you're thinking, okay, we won't deal with that now, we won't look at that. Well, perhaps we need to, because maybe it will become an influence on whatever some of these decisions are that need to be made. And there are many other questions to be asked. It all depends on the situation. It depends on the context. But as we roll up our sleeves, as we work much more dynamically with our own skills, our own tools, our own ability to respond, to work with habit as needed, and to work with more dynamic strategy as appropriate, we can build more comfortable, confident, successful results. We can work from success to success to success. And again, as I said earlier, this builds resilience, confidence and resilience. And it also allows us to be our best selves and to do our best in situations. And that's a very, very good feeling, because sometimes that's the thing. That's the only thing you have, is to do the best that you can with the situation and come up with the kind of result that is fulsome, takes everything into account, and does not sell you short on the outcome. I'm going to tell you a story quickly now about, I kind of mentioned it early on, but I'm going to tell you the story now, about this gentleman who became a hero. He did something very, very dynamic and very, very dramatic. And the point of the story is not to suggest that any of you should be doing dramatic, dynamic things of this sort. It isn't about life-saving. It isn't about running around and attempting to be a hero in every situation. The point of the story is the thought process, what really was going on in this gentleman's mind that enabled him to be able to save someone's life in a very dramatic fashion, and in a fashion that most of us would not be able to do. So this was on, you've probably seen this story. It was some years ago. It was in Washington, D.C. It was on a work day in the morning. And it was on a platform, a train platform outside the city, meaning that it was not underground, it was above ground. And the tracks were laid out there, and there was pebbles and stones in between the tracks, so there was no concrete underneath. There was some space there, and it was a pretty high up. You could see a very big difference between where the platform was and where the tracks were. And this is important, because what ended up happening is a gentleman, just as a train was coming into the station, you could see it in the distance, not too far away, he fainted and he fell on the tracks. And what ended up happening is, because the train was coming in so quickly and rapidly, there was really no resource for anybody to engage in getting him out of there, because normally, and it's happened in the past, 1 or 2, 3 people will jump down and try and lift the person who's fallen and get them back up on the platform. Well, there was really no time for that to happen, and pretty much people were in a panic. One man, just one man, had an inspiration, had an intuition, had an idea. It came into his mind that he could save this man. Now, he had a mechanical background. He did not have an engineering background, but he had a mechanical background. And his first thought was that he could save this man. So he's got this in his head. It's an irrational thought. It's not irrational, it's irrational. It has no foundation to it, no rational foundation to build up to. He just had this thought in his mind. Then, very quickly, he went through a rational analysis. He realized that the train had an undercarriage that was arched, and also, because there were stones and pebbles in between the tracks, that he could do something in this situation. And then came the creative mode. He thought, I'm a small man, he's a small man. If I just pull him straight between the tracks and lay down on top of him, the train will roll over both of us. As I tell this story, I always get chills. I get chills every time I tell this story, because it's a very, very courageous and frightening kind of act to undertake, but that's exactly what he did. He jumped down quickly, pulled the man's sender, laid down, and just as he accomplished that, the train ran over the both of them, and he said that he was able to feel the train run over the top of his head. Well, as you can see, that's the kind of story you don't forget because it is so dramatic, and that's also why I'm telling it, because it is a memorable story. And it's also the kind of story that illustrates the type of thinking and decision-making approach that we've been discussing this morning. Hopefully none of you will be called upon to do anything that heroic, that dramatic, but you can in your own lives make decisions and achieve results that are every bit as dynamic by using decision strategy innovation.